Chapter 2. The Accident. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. We had only lived in our new home, still in Ryde, for about 9 days, when one summer afternoon, I got a call that I had been dreading. It was my biggest fear in life. My auntie Deborah was on the other end of the line and said, "I just wanted to let you know that a car skidded into your mum's car and she's hurt her foot. She's going to the hospital to get it looked at." That was all she shared with me, but yet in the pit of my stomach, I knew something wasn't right. I always feared something happening to my mother. My spirit was restless. I had planned to go to the ice rink that night with my new friends, and I remember still going, but feeling a sense the entire night that something wasn't right. My mother did foster care off and on all throughout my life, and oftentimes we had very aggressive or even rebellious kids living with us. For this reason, my mum had rules, and one of the rules was that she kept a lock on the house phone. She also liked to pinch pennies in any way possible, and using the phone without her permission simply wasn't allowed. We did have one young girl temporarily staying with us during this time, but luckily she was away for several nights on visitation with her family when this happened. When I came home from the ice rink that night, my mum still wasn't home. I wanted to call and find out where she was and how she was doing, but since I couldn't use the phone, I had to wait. Back then, we also had pay-as-you-go mobile phones, but I had no credit, as it's called, and I didn't have any money to buy any. The following morning, the phone rang again, and it was my auntie Deborah. "Your mum's accident was a little more serious than we had first thought. I'm going to come and pick you up," she said. My heart dropped when I heard these words. Where was my sister? I needed to tell her what was going on, but there was no time. My aunt arrived and said we had to leave right away and that we didn't have time to drive by the foyer, which was a youth place for troubled teenagers who no longer wanted to live at home. We got in the car and headed for the hospital. We were quietly driving when my aunt whispered to me, "Your mum isn't doing very well, and I want you to be prepared when you see her. The only thing that saved her life was her airbag." I remember that car ride like it was yesterday. I felt like in that moment, my worst fears were coming true. When we arrived at the hospital, my entire family was standing around my mum, her brother, 4 sisters, and my grandparents. Everyone knew about the accident except me and my sister. I walked towards them all, and they stepped aside. There was my mother lying on a stretcher bed with a full body brace on. I looked into her eyes, and tears filled them as soon as she saw me. I remember her words, "All right, Megan?" She was worried about me, when she was the one lying there with a broken neck. It had been a fatal car crash on a country road called the Downs, notorious for car accidents due to speeding drivers. My mother was lucky to escape. The lady in the other car that caused the collision was not so lucky. She died on impact. Her husband, who had been driving the car, had no injuries, seemingly in total disbelief and couldn't remember anything that happened. And their daughter had been airlifted to Southampton General Hospital in a critical condition. Something saved my mother that day. I wasn't close to my family, but no one offered to help us with anything after the accident. My sister and I were left to fend for ourselves. To be honest, I wasn't fazed, as I thought this was all normal behavior for families. Love was not palpable in our family. After some time, my mother left the hospital, but she needed a lot of care, so she went to stay with my grandparents on the other side of the island. This left me alone in this big old house that we had barely just moved into. The house felt empty, and I didn't like being there alone. What was interesting about this house was that my grandmother used to run a doll's house club from it 3 years ago. At that time, All the rooms were rented out, and the lady that owned the house only stayed on the very top floor and didn't use the rest of the house. It was supposed to be another renovation project of my mother's, needing immediate work. It didn't even have a kitchen, just a temporary makeshift one, with my mother's cooker, stovetop, a microwave, and a refrigerator. When my grandmother learned that we had bought the house, she joked about it being haunted and shared stories about some ghostly encounters that she'd had there. This didn't fill me with confidence because I had already noticed a strange energy in this house. The day we moved in, the sister of the lady who had previously owned the house passed away, and now this car accident had caused another death. Not to mention the eerie presence I felt when I was home. Life continued somehow after my mum's car crash, but I was changed. I didn't know it at the time, but depression had crept into my life, and I slowly stopped going to my classes at school, only attending the ones that I really enjoyed, like art, design, technology, and business studies. I used to walk right out of school and past all the classrooms, even the ones that I was supposed to be in, without any fear. I didn't care, and I began to slowly distance myself from people and even my friends. After a while, the headmaster called me into her office to ask her why I had been absent. I told her about my mum's car accident, and she didn't say much. She let me out of her office, and she never called me back again. I wasn't offered any support or even any help. Without any authority to guide me, I decided I was finished with school. I attended the classes I liked, even achieving a distinction, the highest grade possible, for business studies. In the UK, we can complete school at 16 if we want to, and then go on to college for 2 years, and then attend university, which in the US is called college. Several months passed, and my mother finally came home, but she wore a neck brace for a long time and moved much slower than she was used to. My mother didn't force me to go back to school, and she let me stay home to help her. Renovations on the house resumed, but the weird energy in the place remained. Downstairs, on the very bottom floor of the house, was the worst. It sounds strange, but there was this black mark on the floor that would appear and disappear. We also got a dog shortly after my mother's return, and it would stand at the top of that same staircase and bark, and it would never go down to the bottom floor. It was bizarre. One morning, I came home from school, and the road was cordoned off with police tape. Oh goodness, what was going on now, I thought. As I frantically walked up to the police officer standing there, I said, "I live on the street and I need to get by, sir." So he let me get through. Forensics teams were outside of our house conducting investigations next door on the neighbour's house. There had been a murder next door. This made 3 deaths in the few short months since we had moved in. At 16 years old, I didn't progress to college and decided to get a job at Ride Arena, working in the cafe. Since I spent most of my time there, it made the most sense to me. I loved it. Being busy kept my mind occupied. I wanted to go out, make money, and grow up fast. I wanted to forget about my childhood and all the trauma that I had experienced in my life. We only lived in the haunted house for about 9 months. After the renovation was complete, my mother put the house up for sale and it sold very quickly, thank goodness. We moved into a cottage in the countryside near where my grandparents lived, in a town called Shelfleet. The house was a pre-medieval house, over 450 years old, and even had a swimming pool. It was beautiful. The day we moved out of the old house in Ryde, the sister of the lady whose house we were moving into in Shelfleet died. It was so bizarre. So many deaths in such a short amount of time. We all thought it was a strange coincidence, and we were relieved to be away from that house. As much as I loved our new home in Shelfleet, there was one problem. It was very far away from my work. So, at 17, I got my driver's license and was gone from home almost all of the time. I was still battling depression off and on and started drinking with my friends to numb the feeling. I turned to boys and other things that I thought would preoccupy my mind. I masked it well, and I always wanted to be the life of the party, but inside, I was empty and sad. Back to California. In 2006, when I was 19 years old, I went out to visit my dad in California. It had been quite a few years since I had last visited him. I'd become so consumed with growing up that I sort of pushed my dad away. But I was at that point in my life where I wanted more. I didn't want a mediocre existence, and I thought my dad had the answers. I wanted to learn more about who he was, not from a child's perspective, but now as an adult. I had also realised how blessed I was to have been born in the USA and carry dual nationality. My mum came on this trip with me. She had always maintained a good relationship with my father growing up, and even with my stepmother, Frauke, who he married when I was just 2 years old. Unfortunately, my stepmother and my father had separated in the years that I had been gone, and Frauke moved back to Germany, where she was originally from. On our arrival into LAX, my father collected us in a limousine. He liked to show off sometimes. But when we got into the car, there was a girl sitting in the back seat who was on the phone. She didn't say hello, and it was a little awkward to say the least. She was young, pretty, and seemed to be very close to my dad. I thought maybe she was his new assistant. We had a good trip, for the most part, though I found my father to be different from how I had known him to be. Having separated from Frauke, it seemed he was really craving company and affection. He had dated a bit in the few years that they'd been apart, but I knew he missed my stepmom, and he didn't want to be alone. I felt sad for him. Halfway through the trip, I learned that this assistant girl was actually his new girlfriend. Despite her being MIA for most of the trip, every time I asked him where she was, he'd say, "Oh, I don't know, probably at a party." It was at that point that the gut feeling I had about her in the limo was confirmed. Not only did she not bother to say hello to us, or even speak to us, but she made no effort the entire 2-week trip that we were there. I hoped that it wouldn't last, but it was time to leave and head back to England. After we arrived back, I couldn't shake the idea of my dad being alone in this strange relationship. I was worried about him. We tried to stay in closer contact, and he kept asking me to come out to California permanently. He knew I wasn't happy. In 2007, I returned for another visit, just me this time. When I arrived, my father had neglected to mention a few details. The girlfriend, Victoria, had now moved in and was using my room as a closet for her things. He said she thought I would be more comfortable if I stayed in the house next door, where they had rented a room for me. From the minute I got there, I wanted to leave. But despite being banished to the house next door, I stayed for the entire 2 weeks. Alana, my half-sister, came down to visit me from LA, where she was living at the time. And I managed to have a good time, even though I felt like I couldn't come into my father's house. Victoria was now driving a brand new car paid for by my father and living quite the comfortable lifestyle. There was a 34-year age difference between the two of them. She was only 9 years older than me, and I saw nothing but red flags. I suppose in some ways I was jealous that she was getting all of my father's attention, but I never got a sense of sincerity from her, and considering how wise I believed my father was, I was baffled as to why he couldn't see what I could. I wanted to like her, and I made all the effort I could. Finally, in 2009, I took yet another trip back to California after my father moved from Laguna Beach to Temecula to a beautiful Spanish-style property in Duluth. It was remote and private and boasted its own avocado grove on the property with a stunning swimming pool that overlooked mountain views. The house was a dream. After much convincing on my father's side, my sister came on this trip too, and we had a lot of fun with our father. He seemed to be more relaxed than on previous visits. Victoria was still living with my father and had also made the move from Laguna Beach, as much as she complained about it. But I could sense that she was actually trying to make an effort with us too, finally. Everything seemed perfect, so perfect that I decided I was going to move from England to California and give it a real shot this time. There was a beautiful apartment above my father's house that was mine if I wanted it. So I went back to England for a few weeks, said my goodbyes, quit my job, and headed stateside on a one-way ticket. I was excited to start my new life and really get to know my father. He was a sensitive man. I believe his childhood made it difficult for him to show his emotions. Going through abuse and not knowing his real dad, then joining the Air Force and being taught to push away his own feelings. But despite his lack of affection, I knew he loved us, even if he wasn't so great at showing it. I saw his vulnerability when we were kids, and we would leave at the end of each summer after visiting him to go back to England. Our stepmom, Frauke, would always drive us to the airport. My father wasn't very good at saying goodbyes, so he never came with us. We'd pull away from our home in Laguna Beach, and we'd look out the back window as Frauke drove off. He always stood in the same spot in the garage doorway, holding each side of the doorframe. A soft smile on his lips, and tears running down his face as he watched us drive away. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. 1 John 4:8.
Chapter 3. The Beginning of the End. I spent 9 months living in California. I helped to operate my father's company, Pyradyne, answering the phones, packing orders, and building equipment, as well as getting to know the clients. I learned a lot. I met new friends, got my California driver's license, and started to build a new life. I also developed a close relationship with my dad, something I had always wanted. So close, in fact, that it wasn't appreciated by the other person living in the house. Victoria. I witnessed a lot of dysfunction while living there. There was way too much drinking, childish tantrums, and a lot of arguing and bickering over small things. For a while, things were really working. My father promised to help me get a car, so I wasn't driving his pickup truck everywhere. Though I didn't mind that. I was grateful to drive any car. We spent the evenings together watching movies, and I felt like I was really connecting with my dad. We had deep conversations, and he really opened up to me about why he'd made the decisions that he made in life, and even his relationship with Victoria. I remember one specific conversation where he shared that she was forcing him to get married, or trying to, but he didn't want to because he said he didn't trust her. His words were, "She'll take me for everything I have." When I heard him say this, it really made me question why he was even with her. I knew he cared for her, but at what cost? He couldn't be that lonely, especially since I was there now and spending a lot of time with him. Since my apartment was above the house, many nights I would get locked out of the main house, and I knew it wasn't my dad locking the door. It's not like we lived in an unsafe area. We lived in the middle of nowhere, and there was gates all around the property. It was strange because I wanted to like my dad's girlfriend so much. I would try to convince myself to trust her because of occasional gestures or nice conversations we would have, or even the occasional lunch date. But when I was alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with her. You know when your intuition is talking to you and it's a head versus heart situation, and I felt like I needed to give her a chance for my dad's sake. So I would use the key that my dad gave me and I would let myself back into the house. And when I did, oftentimes, I would hear Victoria down the hallway in her office on the phone after having several drinks. One night, I heard her slurring to someone about my family, my sister and my mother, making fun of them and mocking them. When I told my dad about it, he said she was sick. He said that he had even attended AA spouse meetings to try and deal with her. In December 2009, my mother came to visit us in Temecula, a stopover on her way to Australia to visit her sister Belinda. My mum helped me realize that it wasn't healthy for me to stay in that environment and that I should probably go back to England as much as I didn't want to. But I knew she was right, so when she left for Australia shortly before Christmas, I left too. And this is the part that I wish I could have done differently. I sprung it upon my father that I was leaving just days before my flight. I knew it was wrong, but I felt like he might try and change my mind. And to be honest, while I didn't know exactly how he was going to take the news, I knew he was going to be disappointed. And he was. My father was in total disbelief that I was leaving. He was angry and upset. And I don't blame him. I should have told him the real reasons why I was going, but I couldn't. The day I left, I said goodbye in the hallway and he wouldn't even look at me. He barely even acknowledged me. I had no idea that was the last time I would ever see him again. In the 2 years before my father's death, we exchanged maybe only a handful of emails. It broke my heart that my father was rejecting me, and I knew the influence in his life was only feeding that fire. There was a part of me that was angry at him, and I felt disappointed and let down by him in many ways, and I was frustrated that he just wasn't being honest with himself. So, when I left my father's house and arrived back in England, I knew I had to make a decision to just move on with my life and hope that one day things would change. Bournemouth. This was a chapter I wanted to leave out of this book, mainly because I'd prefer to forget about it. But I can't tell parts of the story without telling the whole story. And if this chapter had never happened in my life, neither would some of my lifelong friendships that exist today. After I had arrived back in England, I didn't want to stay on the Isle of Wight any longer. I had exhausted it and I really wanted a change. Since my mum was away in Australia for a month, I briefly stayed to take care of the house, but as soon as she came back, I knew I wanted to leave. It was such a small island where everyone knew everybody else's business, and when I moved away from it, it was because I was ready to spread my wings. My cousin Ryan lived in Bournemouth, and he kindly offered me a room to rent in one of his flats, or as we say in the States, apartments. Ryan also got me a job working in a bar called Josie's. Every day I would apply for jobs, and before I knew it, I had 3. After all, I love to be busy. In addition to my position at Josie's, I had a job selling Virgin V makeup products and working Monday to Thursday in a call centre selling home insurance. I enjoyed being busy, but after a while I started losing my voice from talking so much, doing cold calling, which I hated, and I realised how much I disliked selling insurance. Once again, my cousin Ryan came through, and he got me a job at Richmond Classics, a local retail fashion store selling high-end brands. I absolutely loved this job. It wasn't long before the owner of Josie's, Matt, took a liking to me, and being vulnerable, I was quickly swept away. Soon after we started dating, he decided that he didn't want me living in a room of a shared flat anymore, so he moved me into his flat, which had beautiful ocean views. He was only there on weekends. I believed he stayed with his mum the rest of the time, so he said. But I didn't find out much about him and his life until later on. He wasn't very open to sharing, and I was pretty naive. One night, shortly after we had started dating, we were driving on the dual carriageway, which is a highway in the US, and we got pulled over by the police. He threw a little white bag at me and told me to hide it. I had no idea what it was, but I obeyed him and I stuck it under the car floor mat. The police officer took him out of the car and arrested him. To this day, I still don't know what for. This should have been a huge red flag to run far away from this man and this relationship, but I didn't. Matt had also decided I didn't need to work at the bar anymore, and I could just come in and enjoy myself instead. Well, I wasn't going to say no to that. A lot of my memory of these days is hazy, but the Bournemouth party lifestyle took a hold of me, and I started drinking a lot. Because of who Matt was, I got VIP everywhere I went. I no longer had to stand in lines and got the best service everywhere I went. I don't remember how, but I finally found out about Matt's drug use. It was every weekend, and some benders would last for several days. I think I believed it was easier to turn a blind eye than to deal with the situation. Besides, it seemed so normal. Everyone in Bournemouth was doing cocaine. Some days I came back from work and there would be a brick of it on the dining table with several half-drunk drinks and a full ashtray, and no sign of Matt. It became such a normal part of life that eventually I tried it too, and I got hooked. Every weekend or every time I would drink, I was using it, and I hated myself afterwards. Sometimes I would go to bed at 4 a.m. and I would get up at 7 a.m. to go to work. I kept saying it was the last time, but I couldn't stop myself when I drank. Most of my friends did it, and we hid it from those who didn't. I didn't like who I was becoming. Matt and I fought a lot, and I learned he had cheated on me. Half the time, he wasn't even around, and I had no idea where he was or who he was with. This only further deepened trust issues with men that I already had. There was a darkness creeping inside of me in a way that I had never experienced before. I was trapped in a lifestyle of having everything I ever wanted, but it was all a lie. And I knew it. If something doesn't change, I often thought to myself, I'm going to die. Miami. When a couple of my friends who worked at Richmond Classics, Catherine and Mona, decided to take a 3-month vacation and move to Miami, they invited me to come out and stay with them. Of course, I jumped at the chance. I'd always wanted to go to Miami. But this would be the trip that turned my whole life upside down. Ever since I was a young child, I'd had very vivid daydreams. Spellbound, I would see a vision, a whole host of detailed events, like a massive instant download of information. It was as though I was watching a movie. Then, just as I had seen it in the vision, it would happen in real life. Sometimes they were bad things, and while I knew what was coming, I was always powerless to stop it or change its course. That day, I got the call sitting on the beach in Miami and receiving the news from my sister that my father had died brought on another one of those visions. As I hung up the phone, images of an uncertain future flashed before my eyes. Change, big change was coming. An overwhelming sense of worry and concern washed over my body, and I turned to look at my friend Catherine. Catherine had lost her own father the year before, to cancer, and her eyes were filled with emotion. I knew she was reading my mind. I felt like I may as well not have a father, I said to Catherine just the night before. She had asked me why we hadn't spoken for almost 2 years and what had come between us, and why I would leave California. So I told her the whole story. Catherine and I had spoken at great length about my father, and I had uttered these hopeless words the very night before his death. "Megan, you weren't to know," Catherine said, looking back at me that day on the beach. She knew exactly what I was thinking. A million thoughts raced through my head at once. Was this all my fault? Had I spoken death into my father's existence? I know that sounds crazy, but I had just said the night before that I didn't have a father. And now look at what had just happened. I felt like it was all my fault. I knew I needed to call my mum, so Catherine and I headed back to her apartment just 2 blocks away. My mother had already spoken with Mary, and she sounded panicked and in shock, just as I was. At the time of his death, my father and Victoria were in Minneapolis, where he had been a guest on an episode of True TV's Conspiracy Theories, a TV show hosted by former WWE wrestler and politician Jesse Ventura. The show had finished filming, and they had been due to fly home to California. My mum and I agreed that I should call Victoria as soon as possible. But this was a call that I didn't want to make. I hadn't spoken to her since I left California, and my intuition was telling me something was very wrong. Besides, we had found out about my father's death by accident. Victoria's mother had been regularly calling my sister Mary to discuss natural treatments for Cameron. I had no idea that they were even in contact, but my sister did still have a relationship with my father after all. Victoria's mother happened to call right after hearing about Dad's sudden death from Victoria, but supposedly Victoria had told her not to tell anyone. Why would she say that? I finally plucked up the courage to call Victoria, whose cell phone number was still saved in my contacts. Upon answering, she was about to board her flight home and sounded very shocked to hear from me. "How did you find out?" she asked me. What a strange question. It was obvious that she really didn't want to talk to me. She briefly explained what had happened to my father before ending the call. After I put the phone down, I felt fear and uncertainty. Something wasn't right. I turned to Catherine and said, "My entire life is about to change. I had no idea how or what was coming, but deep inside my soul, I could feel it, and I knew it was inevitable." Traveling back. The news of my father's death had arrived right at the end of my trip. My flight back to England was leaving in 6 hours, but I wasn't sure what to do or where to go next. I had lots of questions, like why was Victoria leaving my father 2,000 miles away in another state so soon after his passing? And if she was flying back to California, why not invite me, since I was already in the country? As I stood in the shower in Catherine's apartment, staring at the wall, watching the water run down the tiles, I felt dazed and confused. I had yet to cry. I couldn't. I was still in shock. There was so much going on in my head that I felt like I was in a dream, that nothing around me was really happening. In any second, I was going to wake up and everything would be back the way it was. But I wasn't going to wake up. Not from this dream. Not ever. After saying an emotional goodbye to Catherine, I took a taxi to Miami International Airport. The driver was very friendly and talkative, and he asked me where I was flying to, and I just replied with, "My dad died today." He suddenly looked at me in the mirror with a very shocked expression on his face. I couldn't even believe I just said that. I felt numb, vacant, and emotionless. As we flew through the night, I sat in my seat thinking about being a child and visiting my dad every summer, how much fun we'd had. Those days were gone now. I was never going to see my father again. It was right then, in the middle of a crowded plane, surrounded by strangers, that I finally began to cry, and I couldn't stop. When we landed at Heathrow, I made my way straight to Southampton General Hospital to see Mary and check in on baby Cameron. On top of me being exhausted from getting no sleep on the flight, jet lag was settling in, and I felt like I was living inside of a permanent grey cloud. Still, it was good to see my sister and Cameron. He was having a good day, so I took all the cuddles I could get. Mary remained strong, as usual, and I wondered where she got her strength from. It's something that I've always admired about her. Cameron was due to undergo his second round of chemotherapy as soon as his body was strong enough, so it was an anxious time for all of us. We were holding on to the hope that his little body would kick out the vicious disease. I hugged my sister, I said goodbye, and headed for the ferry to the Isle of Wight. I always hated leaving her at the hospital to take care of Cameron alone. Since Cameron had leukemia, they were in isolation, and they weren't really allowed many people to come and visit. And Cameron's dad was back home on the Isle of Wight working, so he would only come and visit on weekends. It must have been so hard for her, being there alone for months on end, and now we had just lost our father. Conspiracy theories. In the very short time since my father's death, we were swamped with calls and messages from family members and friends who wanted to know what happened to him and how he died. They were clearly feeling the same uncertainty as I was about the situation and the circumstances surrounding his death. They were also unable to reach Victoria. Some were even saying he'd been murdered, poisoned, or that it wasn't really him who had died. Some even suggested he'd been abducted by aliens. Jesse Ventura had gone on the radio and spoken of the suspicious nature of my father's death and how concerned he was by the information my father had given to him before his passing. Information so sensitive, he felt that he should go to the police with it. But when it comes to the media, you can never be sure what's genuine or what they're using just to make a good headline. My oldest sister, Alana, who was now living in Reno, had been on the phone with Hennepin County Medical Center, where my father was. They had expressed great concern regarding the number of calls that they had been receiving, and now insisted on only speaking to immediate members of family. I took down the phone number and called the hospital to see what was needed from us. I was shocked when they said that there was no one with my father when he was taken to the hospital, nor was anyone there when he was pronounced dead. Where was Victoria? She had told me that she was there with him. I listened to everything that was being said and tried to process it all without judgment. But I was so sad at the thought of my dad being alone during this time. I needed more answers. I didn't want to, but I knew I needed to. I dialed Victoria's number again. She seemed a little more ready to talk at this point, telling me that she was sitting in his office chair, looking out at the man-made pond that my dad had built, even suggesting that we should spread his ashes there, another thought I was trying hard to process without judgment. I was told I didn't need to be there until my father's body came back to California. No invitation to come to my father's house where I had once lived, and no offer to help me to try and get him back home. My gut instinct was that I needed to go back to the US. There wasn't much I could do or discover while I was so far away. Where was I going to stay though, and where would I even start? That same day, I called some friends that I had met while living in Temecula, near where my father lived, and asked them to stop by his house to see if Victoria was okay. They drove straight there and saw what I feared was happening. Through the locked gates and up the long driveway, there were removal trucks and trailers with people busy packing up belongings. What was going on? It had only been a day since he passed away. When my friends called the door, no one answered. I quickly jumped on the computer to look at flights to California for the following day. I then called Alana and told her I was coming. My mother graciously paid for my flight, and Alana arranged to fly from Reno and meet me at LAX when I arrived. I stayed up most of that night, unable to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking, worrying, not knowing what to do or where to go when we got to California. How was I supposed to get my dad back to his home state without any help from anyone? I had hoped that if I had just turned up at my dad's house, Victoria would let me in and help us devise a plan. My mother stayed up with me the whole night. She cared deeply for my father and still had great respect for him. Never once did I ever hear her speak badly about him my entire life. I arrived at LAX airport on the afternoon of September 27th, just 2 days after my father's passing. As promised, Alana was there to meet me. Her mother, Kim, was a very kind and sweet lady. I had met her many times growing up. She and my father were married, but had separated several years before he met my mother. And my mum would even take care of Alana when Kim was working. It was an unusual dynamic, but everybody got along and everybody was close. My dad had a way of bringing people together, even when Falca came into our lives. She took care of us like her own. My dad seemed to always attract beautiful women into his life, women who were pure-hearted and honest. That was until his marriage to Falca ended. This last-minute trip to California seemed like a good idea, but it had been organized in a rush. I had been flying 12 hours straight and I didn't have anywhere to go or much money, and I still hadn't devised a plan. Alana didn't have much either. So we put together what we had and we decided to rent an economy car and drive to Temecula, in the hopes that Victoria would answer the door. As we were driving there, I thought it might be a good idea to call her and just let her know that we were in California and that we were hoping to come. But she didn't pick up. Her mother did. I was told I wasn't allowed to come because, and I quote, "If my baby sees you, it'll all be too real for her and I just can't have anything happen to my baby." It was not what we wanted to hear. Alana wanted to drive to my father's house anyway, and since we were halfway there, we thought we might as well try. I wasn't prepared for what we saw when we arrived. There were surveillance cameras that had been installed on the gates, and no trespassing signs were everywhere. How strange. We rang the buzzer at the gate several times, but got no answer. Dumbfounded, we drove back to Los Angeles. We managed to stay with one of Alana's friends, who put us up for the night. We were locked out of my father's house. I was not welcome in a home where I had once lived, And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking to myself, if only he knew. I knew that me and my dad were in a rift when he passed away, but he would have never wanted this. So what now? We needed radical help. We needed a miracle.